Coming up on the Mind Caddy.
Beginners or new people to the game are finding the mental side really difficult, and they're finding it very, very easy to sort of collapse under pressure of competition, especially.
Golf, unfortunately, no matter how much money you have in the bank, no matter how much power you have at work or whatever, the game of golf isn't going to bend to your will, is it? And it's not, you can't spend your way to a great golf game.
It's impossible to achieve a high level of consistency in the timing of the lever down force with the pivot around force, because our brain isn't big enough.
It's this ultimate paradox, isn't it? That when you fully accept that you could hit horrendous shots, you lessen the likelihood of that actually happening.
Mind Caddy.
Hello, Jim. You're back again. You're back again. Thanks for joining me again on the show.
Thanks for having me, Carl. I appreciate being back on again. This will be fun.
Yeah, we always have great conversations, and I always wanted you to come back time and time again, because usually in the previous conversation there's some subject or topic crops up, and I think that's going to make a brilliant podcast. And we've got one in particular tonight, Jim. I'll not say what it is straight away, but let's just tee it up with, I think we both agree that these days we're seeing more and more people who seem to be very vulnerable in terms of their ability to deal with what the game throws at them, especially perhaps on the younger. And is that again something in your sort of everyday experience that you're seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing more and more people, partly because we're seeing more and more people play, like we talked about before we started recording. We got a lot more sort of Generation Z and millennials playing. But we're also seeing I think, a lot of beginners or new people to the game are finding the mental side really difficult, and they're finding it very, very easy to sort of collapse under pressure of competition, especially, right? So I thought that would be a good topic to talk about. What is not the superficial reasons, but the really deep-seated reasons, which comes down to one of the in the field of anthropology, one of the pioneers was a Belgian/Frenchman named Claude Lévi-Strauss. He did some of the early research on traditional tribal societies, and he came up with this description of what they would do in their culture, something called Rite of Passage, which we don't have in the West, since the 17th century with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when people left the farm and moved into the city for work. And because of the lack of that rite of passage, the baseline psychological state is somewhere between moderately neurotic or dysfunctional and highly neurotic or dysfunctional. And you don't see that level of neurosis in traditional societies. In fact, if you read the journals of, for example, here in America, some of the early white people, settlers who ended up like fur trappers, for example, having contact with Native American tribes, they were amazed at how resilient and strong what we would call the adolescents are. And so the idea of rite of passage is you go through a trial by fire, a deliberate inducement of some type of suffering, mental, physical, or emotional suffering, to shed your childhood ego and acquire a fully formed adult ego. And it literally could happen in as little as 2 to 8 weeks. Yeah. But we don't have that in the West. And so we have highly neurotic population compared to traditional societies.
Mm-hmm. And you see that, childlike behavior, it can be wonderful in golf, where you remain curious and open, but childish behavior, you see it all over the place. And
right.
It reminds me what you're just talking about there, about a guy I remember seeing recently on a golf course who just got so angry and so annoyed about slow play, and he screamed at me, "Slow play ruins my golf." And and I said to him, looked him in the face and said, "Well, it doesn't have to." And I don't think he appreciated that response. Yeah. But it left an impression on me. I thought, we're in a beautiful place. It's a summer's afternoon. There's options about what you can do on the golf course, but there was such an infantile response that the world wasn't bending to his will. And I think that's what golf, unfortunately, no matter how much money you have in the bank, no matter how much power you have at work or whatever, the game of golf isn't going to bend to your will, is it? And it's not, you can't spend your way to a great golf game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I've been fascinated by that whole idea that traditional societies in general, that the psychological health was far better than modern, technological societies. Because, until again, the 17th century in the West, there was no such thing as adolescence. You went from a kid to an adult in 2 to 8 weeks. And, Eric Erickson's written about the adolescent identity crisis. That's the big one where you had to go through from age 12 to maybe 25. You had to struggle to find your way in the world. And of course, that's no guarantee you will. A lot of people don't. People in their 30s still haven't found out who they are. So I think from a psychotherapeutic standpoint, that's a massive mistake to undervalue how important going through some type of rite of passage is. And we could talk about sort of modern equivalents of that maybe. Yeah.
Just, I mean, in the email that you sent me, just take us through the kind of rites of passage that you had, because you mentioned about the martial arts and the fighting and things like that. What was, looking back on it, what was the journey for you that became so valuable in later life?
Yeah, I was very fortunate in looking back because I had multiple rites of passage. The big one for me was two things that are closely related. I grew up in a very rough neighborhood in the 50s in Chicago with gangs, and there were bullies everywhere. We had all kinds of, there were literally fights every day pretty much in the schoolyard. And my parents got tired of me when I was 6 years old, and we had like a 9-year-old who was bigger and stronger than me and my friends, and he was, not beating us up, but, knocking us down the ground and punching us a little bit. We were terrified of this guy, and my parents got tired of me whining about it, and they convinced me I had to fight back. And I can vividly remember when I finally stood up to this guy, and I basically broke his nose with one punch, and that was it. He never bullied anybody after that. And then I kept getting in more and more fights to either defend myself or my friends who weren't good at fighting. And I got to that state where I felt okay. Now I had been defeated, so to speak, by this bully in the past. I mean, I didn't really fight back much because I was too afraid. But I suddenly realized, oh, I don't have to give in to a bully. I have the ability. I have enough personal power, psychological power, even in physical fighting skill to protect myself. And it really amped up my confidence, not just in terms of the fighting context, but in life in general. I felt more confident in every situation, right? So that's kind of what a rite of passage is designed to do. It's designed to transform you from a vulnerable child psyche to a strong, confident adult psyche. And then I met my first martial arts instructor, Sensei Sugiyama, when I was 11, and he taught me a whole bunch more about how to fight in the context of traditional karate. But he was also a Zen Buddhist monk, and he got me started on my path to studying Buddhism, which also helped, which is also in a way a rite of passage. And then just things I did in my late teens, early 20s, in terms of travel and, really low budget travel and really uncomfortable situations in, poor third world countries, mainly Mexico and Central America. That was another one where you're living in the moment and you realize anything could happen at any time. That's one of the big things one of the big essential attributes of a fully formed adult ego is you recognize that we're living in a universe that's constantly changing and there's nothing to hold on to. And when you can accept that there's nothing you can hold on to, again, it creates more personal power, right?
Hmm. We had a very good friend of mine, Jim, Vin Harris, a Buddhist monk, Buddhist teacher, who I've known for 30 odd years, and we've done a lot together golf wise. And he's talked so much about impermanence. And I think if you look at a round of golf through the lens of impermanence, it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? That we've all been there, where you go out and maybe you're playing better than you normally would, you get a couple under par or whatever it may be that's better than your normal, I say in quotes, golf. It's so seductive, isn't it, to try and hang on to that and to try and protect it. When,
Yep.
as you say, if you can fully embrace the impermanence, and impermanence doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily drop shots. Impermanence could be you could shoot 5 better than you've ever done before.
That's
But it's
right.
But it's moving away from this this desire that we have to control the future,
Right.
when the only thing we know about the future is that we don't know what it's going to be.
That's right. We can only control our behavior to some degree in the present moment. We can't control future outcomes by definition because we don't have a time machine, right? So, yeah. So I think in general, the idea of rite of passage is, how do you become a confident, strong adult who can handle stress, suffering, disappointment, heartbreak, any type of suffering you can imagine? How do you handle suffering in a mature way where you don't have an emotional meltdown like a 3-year-old would? But if in other words, if 50% of your overall psyche is a 3-year-old and the other half is an adult, you're going to find situations when you get too easily triggered by some type of stress or suffering, and then you're going to react like a 3-year-old. And we see that on the golf course all the time. Yeah.
And what would you say? I'm assuming that sort of trying to find some bullies and fighting back is probably not the best route for everybody to go down in terms of a rite of passage. Yeah. What practical steps would you suggest people could even think about or explore, and some of the things that you do with your students?
Well, the first thing is to realize you don't have to go through a rite of passage as a 12 to 14-year-old. You can do it at any time in your life, right? Even as an adult. But it would be trying to find a very difficult experience. I'll just give you several examples. So, for example, you could take up learning a difficult to master musical instrument, like say piano or guitar or violin, and just work at that. Because as you know, those 3 instruments, especially piano and violin, are very, very difficult to even come close to being good at. So it might take you several years to get sort of in the ballpark. In the meantime, you're going to fail and you're going to fail and you're going to fail. And that idea of embracing failure on purpose and realizing it's an essential nature of the path of mastery, right? So you'll learn things like patience, persistence, perseverance, not giving up. Or it could be, like I mentioned, traveling on a low budget in a 3rd world country and putting up with the crazy stress that can produce. It could be very, very long backpacking trips by yourself in the mountains or the desert. One of the things I also did was, this is an example of that we now call, back then they weren't called extreme sports, but an extreme sport, like a 60-mile race in the mountains. One of the things my son does. He also climbs frozen waterfalls in the winter for fun. So find some extreme sport that by its very nature, failure is very common. It's very difficult to do. For me, it was to see how long I could hold my breath. I was doing free diving back before it was an actual sport, to see how far I could dive down. I spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, here in Hawaii, where I am now. I still do it today. I try to swim a long way underwater, holding my breath, right?
Right.
It's potentially dangerous. You could die from it. So you want something that is sort of dangerous, but not too dangerous. You want to find that sweet spot right in between the two.
And the prize at the end of it, I'm assuming, is resilience, is being able to deal with whatever chaos life throws at you. I know you've mentioned that you've got something that you do with your golf students about being prepared to shoot much higher scores than you would normally do. Maybe go into some detail on that, because I think for everybody listening, that might be, from a golfing perspective, a practical entry point into exploring this.
Well, this is sort of golf rite of passage, where you deliberately sign up as a single on a crowded public course, where you'll be, where it'll be typically on a weekend when it's crowded, and you'll be paired with 3 strangers. And let's say you're a 12 handicap at the time, so your average score would be roughly, low to mid 80s. So you got to shoot about 20 strokes higher than your average score on purpose. But don't tell the 3 strangers. So you're deliberately setting up exactly the environment that almost every amateur golfer is terrified of, which is catastrophic failure in terms of scoring and shot outcomes on the golf course, with other people watching your quote unquote collapse, right? In other words, you're trying to trigger on purpose the powerful negative emotion called humiliation or shame on purpose, because that's the thing that's driving all your neurosis on the golf course, is you're trying to run away from shame. So, I think the most effective in terms of modern psychotherapy one of the most effective, if not the most effective protocol is called exposure therapy or desensitization therapy, where you go toward the thing you're afraid of, not away from it, right? And the feedback I get from students who do this is it's the most positive and fastest and most profound transformational change of any exercise I know of, because they walk off the 18th green having shot like 105 instead of 80, and they feel liberated. They get the fear monkey off their back, right?
And just thinking from a sort of brain perspective with that, Jim, is that ultimately then your brain is going to reduce or eliminate the perception of threat on the golf course, because that's the big driver that stops
That's
people
right.
realizing the potential, isn't it? That the brain is picking up threat, as you say. And that's, I think, just to butcher a Sid Banks quote, about if people would stop resisting their experience, that alone would transform the world. And that's a similar tenet, isn't it? You're basically confronting the reality that this could happen and going into it rather than resisting it and avoiding it.
100%. You could say that the purpose in traditional societies, the main purpose, there's some secondary purposes, but the primary purpose, well, actually, there's two forms of rite of passage. We'll get to that in a minute. But the primary form of rite of passage, the main purpose of it was to from terms of modern neuroscience language, was to desensitize the amygdala.
Yeah.
The amygdala is this little organ in your brain. You got one in each hemisphere. It's the size and shape of an almond. It has two main jobs. It lays down the initial tracks for memory formation, and it scans your physical environment for threats. Now, it was originally designed by natural selection for threats to your bodily harm or even your death, right, to prevent death. But over time, as our culture evolved, it became trying to protect your ego, your self-image, from psychological wounding or harm, right? And so a child has a much more hypersensitive amygdala than an adult, because naturally a child doesn't have the means to protect himself or herself. They have to rely on adults to do that, right? So part of this transformation from child psyche to adult psyche is to do the things you're afraid of to calm down your hypersensitive amygdala. And the reason why I think this is so important is we talk about stuff all the time. You got people on your podcast all the time, well-meaning people trying to give advice from a traditional therapeutic standpoint, or even more likely traditional, or rather a modern sports psychology standpoint. All that stuff works to some degree, but it works way better if the person who's trying to employ the protocols has a fully formed adult ego in the first place.
Yeah.
But most people don't. Most people still have that inner child who's never been transcended or never been transformed, right?
Mm, mm, mm. And then you look at all of the sort of behaviors that we have to try and protect us from these situations, that we then avoid so much of life, that life shrinks to a very small offering then, doesn't it? That, as you say, if there's some form of rite of passage and you're willing to experience the variety of outcomes in any field, the world opens up, doesn't it? I mean, it's Michael Jordan's famous quote, isn't it? I can't remember it exactly, about how many times he missed, and that was his perception of why he was such a great player, and he made the winning throw so many times in big games because he was prepared always to miss.
Yeah, that's right. Ben Hogan, of course, had this. Back to Ben, like we talked like last podcast with me, he was really big on this principle. He actually gave himself permission. He called them 5 stinkers. So as he walked from the range or the putting green to the first tee, he had a conversation with himself, and he said, "It's okay for me to hit 5 really, really bad shots today. I'm not going to be upset unless I hit a 6th one." So it was a brilliant kind of reverse psychology way of saying it's an essential part of the game. You're going to fail to hit quality shots some of the time, right? But then, the other aspect of this, when you have a fully formed adult ego, which he did, we could talk about his rite of passage at some point if you want. When you can accept it deeply, ironically, it makes it less likely that you'll get a bad shot. It's
the ultimate paradox, isn't it?
Right, it's a big paradox, because the more you try to not fail, the weakened that attempt to not fail, especially with emotion, trying emotionally by adding fear to what might happen, a few seconds from now in terms of shot outcome, that weakens the brain to body connection. The so-called mind-body connection is weakened, which means you're more likely to hit a bad shot when you're afraid of hitting a bad shot. But when you can fully embrace the possibility of hitting the worst 6-iron you've ever hit, say in the last decade, that makes it very unlikely that that will happen, ironically.
It's funny, I'm smiling as you're saying that. Over the last couple of years, I've found a really simple principle that's helped a lot of players, that if you get them to understand that whenever you play golf, you'll have a bunch of what I call ones, twos, and threes, where one is a good shot, two is a good enough shot, and three is a poor shot. And some players have really, really made progress by even writing down, before they even go on the golf course, today I'm going to give myself 10 threes or 15 threes or 7 threes or whatever it is. And it's the very act of surrendering to the likelihood that you're going to do that before you play. A, when they come along, you're not surprised, and B, you deal with it much better. But as you said, Jim, it's this ultimate paradox, isn't it? That when you fully accept that you could hit horrendous shots, you lessen the likelihood of that actually happening.
That's exactly right. It's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
But
So
you've got to do it genuinely, haven't you? Where you can't
correct.
it's like acceptance. You can't play at it as in, right, I'll say that I'm going to hit 8 bad shots if it makes me play better. It doesn't you can't fool the system, can you? You're either all in or you're not.
That's right. You can't fake it. It's got to be genuine for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that's what real rites of passage give you. It cuts through a lot of the childhood psyche kind of bullshit. The vulnerability, the insecurity, the feeling you need that you don't have enough in you to deal with life, that you need somebody else to help you out. It's really powerful when you can shed all that and have a super high degree of confidence in your ability to withstand whatever life throws at you. Well, it's like what Nietzsche said, the German philosopher. He said, whatever doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. Or what the Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, one of the Caesars and one of the emperors of Rome, he wrote a book called Reflections. He talks a lot about this, So I would advise all your listeners out there, if you haven't had a rite of passage, try to find one quickly. It'll definitely help you play better golf in terms of scoring. And also, you'll find it more enjoyable to play golf when you don't have fear driving everything. We shouldn't have fear on the golf course. It's crazy to have fear, right? Why would you have fear over a golf shot? It's completely irrational.
Yeah, I've often said I worked in rugby league for a while, and if there's ever a sport where you should go out on the pitch and have a significant amount of fear, it's that sport, because the consequences of mistimed tackles are pretty high.
Sure.
And I never ever saw in rugby league anything like the amount of fear that I see in the game of golf.
That's a good point. In fact, I see more fear in the golf course than, and I've been involved in pretty much every sport you can name since a pretty young age. It just isn't a thing like it is in golf. There's way more fear out there. I think it's that humiliation factor. People are trying to avoid humiliation. I think it's partly because the nature of golf is when you do fail, it can be spectacularly colossal level of failure compared to other sports, right?
That's the thing, and I often say that in the seminars that I do, that if you look at any other sport that you've played, the difference between your good days and your bad days, whatever standard you're at, is never as far apart as it is at golf, is it? Where even the best players in the world can be 20 plus shots from the best to the worst on any given day. You mentioned Hogan's rite of passage earlier on, Jim. Just go through that. What exactly happened, or what was his situation?
Yeah, I think people don't realize it. He had basically two. One was horrific. When he was 14 years old, his first day of high school, he came home and he opened the door to his house and saw his dad commit suicide with a handgun. And again, this was obviously not a deliberate rite of passage, but he had to grow up really quickly after that. And, it taught him, his response to that was he learned to develop a strong sense of self-reliance, right? Yeah. And you could almost argue that maybe the universe provides us at the time, we don't enjoy it because it's intense suffering, but you could make the Stoic philosophical argument that one of the essential aspects of being alive in this universe we live in is that sometimes life itself provides a rite of passage, and you don't have any choice except to work through it, right? That would be an example. The other one is that he was not very good. His first few years on tour, he was, at best, middle of the pack, and he lost his card, I think, twice, and almost was gonna just stop playing on tour, just teach for a living, and he gave it one more try. Um, one of the things I mentioned in my email to you was the only time I think rational fear can happen, because I have this discussion a lot. I work with a lot of young, aspiring mini tour pros who are trying to get on the PGA Tour or the European Tour, and, some of these guys don't have a backer. They don't have they're basically they've got an X amount of money in their savings account, and they got maybe a year or 2 to try to make it. So then you could argue it's harder for those guys to let go of the fear thing because they know that if they don't make the cut on Friday afternoon, they may not be able to make their house payment,
Yeah.
right? So it's a little more difficult for people like that. Hogan had a financial backer. He had a wealthy oil tycoon backing him. Yeah.
It's I've experienced that a lot with young players trying to make it on tour, and as difficult as it is, I think you've still got to go down the route with them of, at a deep level, getting them to believe that whatever happens, you will be okay. Because
Correct.
unless there's a deep-seated belief that you're going to be okay, whatever happens, it's not that you're going to enjoy missing the cut or the poor outcomes, but there has to be a level of. Chuck Hogan called it a safe place to play from. If we're
That's
not in a safe place to play from, the game becomes very, very difficult, doesn't it?
that's right. Yeah, and I think that feeling of that you're in a safe place sort of all the time. One of my early Buddhist teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, who was a Tibetan monk, he called it basic sanity. And I think the goal of your attempt to become more healthy psychologically, the first line goal should be, how can I move from basic insanity or neurosis, which is a psychological state driven by threats and fear, to basic sanity? And one of the essential traits of basic sanity is unshakable confidence in yourself, that you have accepted that the nature of human existence is some of the time you're gonna effing suffer, and the best way to deal with that is to fully embrace the suffering and not push it away or run away from it. But again, it's not you're strong enough that the suffering will not break you. It's that whole trial by fire idea, right?
And you can actually bring that back, can't you, golf-wise, to an individual shot, that when you go out there, I know Vin always talked about the second arrow, that in the set, which is a Buddhist tenet, isn't it? That
Right.
the first arrow is going to come along. You're going to miss a putt.
Right.
You're going to knock it out of bounds. You're going to duff a pitch or whatever. That is going to happen, as we've already talked about. But whether you then fire, that's the pain will come along. But suffering is when you fire the second arrow, which is your reaction to the duff.
Yeah, you're shooting yourself with the arrow on the second arrow, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're overreacting to the first arrow, and in Buddhism, that's called reactive suffering, or it's also called unnecessary suffering, because it's possible to not react to the first suffering or the karmic suffering that life throws at you, right? It's possible to really dig down deep and realize, I can deal with this. I'm not a bad person because I'm failing.
Yeah.
So we could talk about some of the aspects of the adult ego. Maybe we should do that for a few minutes, yeah?
Yeah, carry on, Jim. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of them is, we talked about accepting impermanence. Now, obviously, the big one there is, that means especially accepting your own mortality. I worked with a client right when COVID hit from England. I won't tell you who it is, but it's a sort of a celebrity. And this person had never gone through any type of adolescent identity crisis, any type of rite of passage. He was like a partier through his teenage years, and he was having massive panic attacks because of COVID, and he was terrified of dying. So I worked through him in 2 sessions. I worked through that issue with him in 2 sessions. And the first session, he goes, after we talked for about an hour, he said, "Well, do you have any exercises I could do to help me with my fear?" I go, "Yeah, there's a great book called The Plague by the great French existentialist, novelist, and philosopher Albert Camus." He goes, "It's called The Plague?" I go, "Yeah, it's called The Plague. It takes place in Algiers, and then it was a French colony before World War II. And It's about a small town where people are dying of this virus, and he's the small town doctor treating them. And he goes, "Wait a minute, Jim, you're telling me I'm hiring you to help me overcome my fear." I go, I'm telling you, you can't overcome your fear unless you face your fear. So read the book and think about it." So
Mm.
he had never even considered about the true existential fact of being alive on this planet is you could die at any moment, and you don't know when that moment's going to be.
Mm.
Right? That's in the Buddhist tradition, especially. They even have a type of meditation where you go into graveyards and you sit next to headstones of dead people all night long, and you contemplate your own potential demise at any moment as a way of liberating yourself from fear. Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
that would be the extreme example. Another one is when you have a fully formed adult ego, you're able to see life as mostly nuanced uh, aspects of existence. Meaning, there's a type of childhood view of the world where it's called all or nothing or binary thinking. It's either black or it's white. It's up or it's down. And generally, most of the time in life, things are more in the middle.
Yeah.
Hence the term in Buddhism, the middle way, or in the Greek emperor Pericles, the golden mean. So seeing that most things in life are not on either end of the spectrum, they're somewhere in the middle.
Mm.
Having a nuanced view, that's a part of an adult ego. F. Scott Fitzgerald, American novelist, said the sign of an intelligent person is to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. That's what I'm talking about. No.
Just on that, Jim, we've talked about these things a bunch before, but I think you just hit the nail on the head there, that you see so many people, and I think, well, surely there's more better things to do in life than they're on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and they're arguing a point of, let's say with chipping, that you should be steep, you should be shallow. I mean, and it's this all or nothing
I know.
dichotomy, and
Yeah.
as you say, to lose that ultimate desire to be right.
Mhm.
I think is a sign of an adult ego, isn't it? Really, where
Yes,
there's this
yeah.
infantile desire to be right and everybody else is wrong. Whereas when you can actually say it depends, or it might be this, or it might be that, depending on the individual.
That's right.
I think
Yeah.
I think not only is it an adult ego, but it actually makes an awful lot more enjoyable and comfortable life.
Yeah, we see binary thinking, I think, more in golf instruction than instruction in any other sport. It's really crazy. It's always been that case. It's always
Yeah.
been from one extreme to the other. It's crazy. Yeah.
Mm, mm,
Another trait of the adult ego is you don't take things personally. So when something bad happens, some type of stress or suffering, the person who has a big child ego still intact in their mindset will react, will take it personally. Like the guy you mentioned about the slow play.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you don't take things personally, you're going to suffer a lot less when you
Yeah.
can just let things happen without saying, "Oh, it's happening to me." It's happening, but it's not just happening to you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting with certain players that I can think of who they are so convinced that they are the unluckiest person in the world, and the golfing gods are not bending to their will, and you just, that's a perfect example of taking the game personally, isn't it? And when
Yeah.
it bounces left, it's on the golf course; it bounces right, it's out of bounds. It's just part
That's
of
right.
the variety of the game.
Well, it's interesting. We're starting to see a movement among younger tour pros to embrace the stuff we're talking about, which is basically it's a combination of Buddhism and Stoicism. I know Rory McIlroy's been reading Marcus Aurelius in the
Has
last
he?
couple of years.
Has he?
I don't know if Scotty Scheffler has done any reading on this, but he certainly has the personality of a very, very adult ego.
Yeah.
I don't know what his rite of passage was. He must have had one. I'm certain he did. But one of the reasons he's so unshakably calm is he has such equanimity out there, such emotional stability, as he doesn't take things personally. It's pretty interesting. I love watching him play. I think his mental game is the best ever in the history of the game. I really do.
Yeah. And I think maybe the deep faith that he has a big part to play in that, because ultimately,
Yeah.
ultimately, then you aren't taking it serious. You aren't taking it personally, are you? Because it's
That's right.
it's a higher force at play. Just moving direction, Jim, from this, because I think we could go endlessly into this. I think it's fascinating. But you mentioned before we started, and we've touched on this a number of times, but I think it does need reinforcing, that you're seeing more and more examples of people all the way through the game, not just short game, all the way through the game with the yips. Again, what are you seeing as being the primary factor that there's just this massive increase in people seeking out your knowledge and coaching in terms of helping them deal with the yips?
Yeah, I think the main driver in the last, say, 12 years has been because of the explosion of the internet and social media. We're seeing so much posting by golf teachers on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, of incredibly high-tech explanations. There's been an embrace of tech in general, and particularly in scientific explanations for what tour pros are doing in their swing. Yeah. And I think the sort of the hidden premise behind that type of instruction is if you could just describe what shows up on video or what the 3D motion capture vests say or what the ground force reaction plates say, that just understanding that technical explanation somehow will enable you to acquire a good golf swing. I think that's complete bullshit. I mean, that's not how it works. I see people all the time who are actually worse players now after, say, 2 years of going down that rabbit hole than they were before they started going down the rabbit hole. They get worse because now they've got more swing thoughts now than they had 2 years ago. And swing thoughts don't work. I mean, swing thoughts only can work in terms of creating new movement patterns when you're moving very slowly. As soon as you're moving fast, it's a different part of your brain that's controlling your body. It's not accessible to thinking. Right?
And as we said earlier on, I think maybe it's not happened yet, but at some point, I think there'll be a tipping point with this where people will realize that overloading with information and great sounding stuff and sounds wonderful, and the teacher sounds very knowledgeable, but it's a real block to actual learning and breakthrough and enjoyment of the game.
That's right. Yeah, because again, describing what you see in words or even in visual images is not the same thing as training your brain / unconscious mind, because it has to be unconscious. You can't do it consciously by the very nature of it because it's happening so fast, right? There's a complete difference between training the brain to send a signal to various muscles to fire at a certain rate for a certain level of intensity in a certain sequence. That's a mind-body connection approach, right? And that means you have to have a whole different set of skills and concepts as a teacher that most traditional teachers are not even aware of. For example, the 3 sensory channels would be one, or meta-awareness would be another, or the difference between thinking and feeling your body would be another, right? Yeah.
Which again, I think the future when coaches are combining great technical knowledge, because I think, we're not saying for 1 minute, don't go and study the golf machine and don't go and definitely study stack and tilt, whatever it is that you're into, ground reaction forces, study all of these things, but then understand how you actually apply that and the language that you use and the experience that you create for people that you're working with. So
I've been experimenting lately, just since I've been here in Hawaii the last couple of months, with kind of slightly different approach to what we're talking about in terms of how do you learn better, new and better movement patterns. And my light bulb was toward the end of last year was, a lot of the stuff that's being recommended with this highly technical micro movements, there's some rules in motor learning theory, one of which is when you're trying to learn a new athletic motion that's by its very nature is insanely complicated, lots of moving body parts, right? You want to work on the big picture, the big macro movements first and save the micro movements later, because the micro movements require a macro movement as the foundation to already have been in place, right? So, for example, to me, you're wasting your time working on wrist mechanics, the release of your wrist angles if your pivot's effed up, because if you have a bad pivot, it's impossible to learn how to release the wrist angles on time properly, right? So it should be like a hierarchical first things first. But then it occurred to me, a lot of what these teachers are trying to do, they're trying to explain, again, purely their premise is if we can describe what we see in scientific language, that somehow that's going to lead to a breakthrough. And it occurred to me that, some of the stuff they're recommending, again, micro movements, it's the reason why they're teaching that as a standalone separate thing that you have to learn proactively is because they don't know how to help their students be better at something called coordination. In other words, if your coordination is good, you'll learn that stuff sort of on your own naturally. You don't have to learn it proactively. So to me, the big issue in golf swing instruction especially is why is it so difficult to blend simultaneous movement patterns?
Mm.
It's like rubbing your tummy and patting your head and jumping up and down on one foot. How do you do that?
Mm.
How do you stay in balance and have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 movement patterns happening more or less simultaneously? How do you blend them? That's really the blending part. So I've been moving away, especially in the last few months, from even that technical aspect. I've been moving more toward trying to get my students to coordinate, to learn the skill of coordination, right?
Mm.
You don't often hear the word coordination anymore in golf instruction. I also call it blending, right?
Mm.
How do you blend the uncocking down of your wrist and your right elbow with your pivot?
Mm.
That's a skill that is like rubbing your tummy and patting your heads on steroids. So the only way to do it is to recognize what the two patterns are first, and then how do you blend them? Well, you can't teach anybody how to blend. You can just say, spend time in field channel in meta and feel what it's like when the blending is on one end of the spectrum versus the other, and then try to find the middle. Yeah.
Mm. So what would that practically look like? And what could somebody explore with that in trying to coordinate movement?
So, for example, what I do, and I know we're in audio, we're not going to do this video, correct? When you publish this, yeah. So, if you imagine what the levers do in the downswing from the top of the backswing, the levers are the 2 upper arms, the trail elbow, which is bent to roughly 75 to 90 degrees, and your 2 wrist cock angles. So what that macro movement pattern is from the top of the backswing, your upper arms go straight down and return to your chest first, without the the trail elbow angle starting to open, or without the wrists opening. Then the elbow angle opens down without the wrist going, and then the wrist go. So it's like a 1, 2, 3 sequence. And if you watch me do it, it looks like I'm doing exactly the same thing if I was chopping wood. And I do actually heat my house with a wood stove in the winter. So I do this all the time. So it's sort of like an axe chopping or a wood chopping drill, right? So there's that. And then there's the pivot. And to do the pivot, you take your arm, you fold your arms across your chest, and you just do the tilts and the rotation and the pressure shift part. So those are the 2 main macro movements in the golf swing. Right. So once I have the student do both of those separately, right, then we'd start to blend.
Mm.
And so I'll say, try to do too much down, because in terms of the 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, and height, what the levers do is mostly down. It's a little bit toward midline of your body, but a little bit, not a lot, mainly with the upper arms. But it's 90% down. So you have a down force with your levers unfolding, along with, at the same moment in time, a horizontal dimension or a round force with your pivot.
Right.
So I'll say, do the down force first and then delay the pivot a little bit. And of course, what happens when you do that, especially with an iron, you hit it super fat, and it tends to go off to the right if you're riding a golfer, because your path goes into out too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I'll say, now again, doing it wrong on purpose. Then I'll have the opposite. Try to pivot early and fast and delay the downforce, right? Then you're over the top. Your path goes out to in. You'll top the ball, thin the ball. So to hit the ball solid, you have to blend in pretty much equal proportions the pivot force, the around force, with the down force from the levers. And there's a moment when you can feel the synchronization happen, and assuming your grip is correct and your grip pressure is correct and your setup's correct and your aim is correct, because those are all important prerequisites, then you just nail the ball, and you can hear the sound of compression. It goes straight or reasonably straight and reasonably far. And the student has an aha moment. Oh, a lot of what I was working on in the past, I was trying to master individual micro movements, when the problem was I could not coordinate the 2 macro movements in the first place. And that's the essential problem in the golf swing, is the inability to coordinate those 2 macro movements.
Yeah. I mean, John Jacobs talked a lot about that 50, 60
did.
years ago, didn't he?
He
About
really did.
blending the arm swinging up and the body turning. But what you've
Well,
just
you know,
said there,
but
go on, sir.
yeah, yes. No, sorry. Go ahead, Carl.
I was going to say what it reinforces there is what we've talked about tonight is being prepared to go either side and be okay with failure, be
That's
okay
right.
with topping it if you're rotating too early and you're coming over the top.
That's right.
Be okay with catching it heavy if you're making the downforce
That's
too
right.
prominent.
Because this is again back to Hogan on his deathbed. I think we might have talked about this last time, but he had one regret, which is that he spent too many hours. He told his wife trying to perfect the golf swing. His deathbed realization was impossible to perfect it. And I think he did perfect the balance part. He did perfect the tempo part. But what he was referring to is what we're talking about. It's impossible to achieve a high level of consistency in the timing of the lever downforce with the pivot around force because our brain isn't big enough.
Yeah.
We don't have enough brain matter to do that at a high level of consistency, even though he came closer than any human, for sure, before or since. I mean, even as good as Scotty Scheffler is, he's nowhere near where Hogan was in terms of ball striking, right? Hogan was at a level all by himself. So I think accepting that sometimes your timing is going to be off and your downforce will be too early or too late relative to your pivot or the opposite.
Yeah.
And you're going to hit off. You see it every day, particularly on Sunday in the back nine on tour. You see these guys are hitting fairway after fairway all day. Right. And they get around the 14th or 15th hole on the par fours or par fives where they're hitting driver. And all of a sudden it goes 50, 80 yards right or 50, 80 yards left when there's pressure, because pressure weakens the mind-body connection.
Yeah.
And once it's weakened, your ability to time the downforce with the around force kind of goes out the window, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Jim, as ever, it's leaving the door open for further conversations, but I think the whole idea of Rite of Passage was a brilliant basis for tonight's conversation.
Can I ask you a question before we go?
Of course.
Did you have one as a kid growing up, or if you had one as an adult?
No, I definitely didn't have one as a kid. But what happened to me recently, as you know, a few years ago, finding out that I had really serious heart issues, and then all the complications afterwards with that, I think that definitely has been my Rite of Passage. And
that's what I thought you were going to say.
Very, very different person now from the guy who'd sailed through life pretty easy, really, up until a few years ago. So I do perceive the world very differently now.
Yeah. Do you think it was sort of a blessing in disguise in a way? Did it make you a stronger person?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't feel like it at the time. For those 2 or 3 years afterwards, certainly, I didn't see it that way. But I look back on it now, and I think, it's made me appreciate things so much more, and you know, the value of friendships and conversations and things like that. And it's surprising how it really is, and it's a cliche to say, but it's a cliche for a reason, how the simplest of things can make you feel so good. You know, it's funny. I couldn't even train for a long time, and I'm gradually, with the guys from Par for Success, got back into the gym again. It's not like I used to train when I was a kid, where I was all alpha and throwing big weights around and stuff like that. It's mainly mobility and what have you. But I trained this afternoon, and then we've had terrible weather here for so long in the UK, and I came out of the gym, and it was in the afternoon. There was a little bit of warmth in the air finally, and this sounds terribly cliched, but I can only just reply to what you said. I was walking from the gym to the car, and there was a bit of heat in the sun, and I could hear all the birds. I genuinely noticed the sound of the birds around, and I thought, wow, that's, you know, it's the simplest thing in the world. And as I say, it sounds cliched, but it was just a special moment, thinking, A, I've been able to train, and B, I've actually noticed, because I definitely wouldn't have noticed any of that a few years ago. I would have just gone from the training session would have been this for that. I would have been training this for something else, rather than actually genuinely enjoying the session and then noticing something as simple as, you know, hearing the birds at the beginning of spring in the UK.
Wow, that's amazing. Look, it gets back to the whole thing that when you accept that the universe's impermanence, including your life, the fact that you're alive and could die at any moment. Ironically, you know, Alan Watts, one of your countrymen, wrote a lot. He was one of the premier Westerners who introduced Buddhism to the West, and he was brilliant. He wrote a great book I recommend highly. It's my favorite book on philosophy, called The Wisdom of Insecurity.
Yeah.
And he talks about how when you can deeply accept the essential impermanent nature, that there's nothing to hold on to, it opens up your heart and you become more loving and more kind and more empathetic to other people's suffering.
Mm.
And you become more grateful for the positive moments that do happen when they do happen.
Yeah.
So you appreciate the good stuff when it is happening because you suffered.
Yeah.
Right? They're not opposite. They're actually two sides of the same coin. I had a similar experience yesterday. We had a huge rainstorm the last 3 days here, massive flooding, road closures. You're driving down the road and there's like a 3-foot wall of water coming towards you. And I was kind of bummed out because I like to be out on the beach. This is why I come here. I want to be in the sun, right? That's my thing in the winter, to be in the sun and in the ocean swimming and free diving. And I thought, I was sort of in a funk. Which I don't normally do, but I was indulging in a little bit of self-pity, which is a child ego kind of thing, right? I thought, just because there's nobody out there. I'm talking about pouring rain, gray skies, the beach is empty. But I have this ritual every morning. I swim for 30 minutes. So I made myself get in the water yesterday in the pouring rainstorm. And as soon as I got in the water, I felt fantastic. It's like, this is way better to be stuck in a little tiny condo, right? Little prison cell condo, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a similar type of experience. I've really felt grateful that I could actually be in Hawaii, even if it was terrible weather, and be swimming in the ocean, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that point about gratitude is that, again, bringing it all the way back to golf as we conclude, I think being genuinely 100% heartfelt grateful for the opportunity the next time that you play is a great way to dampen the amygdala down, because you're not waiting for the game to make you feel happy. You're actually grateful for the next opportunity that you have to play.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's really true. Yeah.
Jim, as ever, wonderful to be with you as always. Great having these conversations. Just remind folks about if they need to see or get the chance to come out and see you in the mountains or in the Hawaii in the winter. Where can they come and see you and get in touch with you?
I do in-person instruction in Portland in the summer, and I do in the winter here in Hawaii. I'm going to be doing it starting next year in Tucson. In the latter half of the winter. I'm doing the first half here, and then from mid-February to early April in Tucson. I do most of what I do lately, and since COVID, is webcam. I do webcam lessons pretty much every day. I do a lot on mental game, a lot on yips, fair amount on short game, decent amount on putting mechanics and full swing as well. Yeah, balancepointgolf.com is the way to get a hold of me. Yeah, thanks for that, man.
Thanks, Jim. This concludes this conversation, but there'll be another one pretty soon, I'm sure.
Well, you know what we got to do, Carl? We got to do Hogan Part 2. There's so much more stuff we could talk about. Hogan stuff is so interesting to me,
Yeah. We'll definitely do that. But thanks, Jim.
All right, thanks, man. Take care.
Mind Caddy.